So Miriam is really the instigator here in this. And by the way, it's not very well known. He's sort of done it on the down low. He's not publicizing this, but he now has another wife, and she is Ethiopian. Now, we know about Ethiopian people, don't we? They are very, very black. And now, whether that was a point of contention or not, I don't know, because around the world today, when you go to places that can have darker skinned people, they very much don't want their dark skin. They want whiter skin. So when you go into Central and South America, if you have you typically don't marry somebody with a darker skin than yourself. And your parents will work very hard to get somebody with a whiter skin. And so you see people on TV in Central and South America, they're very European white looking, even though it's a very small population of the nation that they're speaking from and doing the news from. You see the Asian women, they'll have the big giant hats. I know when I golf, and there's usually Korean ladies there, and they have gloves on all the way up and big giant and a scarf around their face, and they really don't want to get darker. They want as white a skin as they can. So it's sort of been a thing. Okay? I'm not saying it's a good thing, okay? I'm just saying it's a thing. Now, when we study in Song of Solomon, it appears that his wife also was black. And most likely she was Ethiopian. There is a group of Ethiopians that have lived as Jews. I'm not going to go into this, but they brought them over in the 80s from Ethiopia, and they were keeping the law, and the Jews got a big parliament and said, let's send some guys over there to see if we can count these very black, thin, regular Ethiopian-looking people as Jews. And when they went and researched it out, for over 1,000 years, then they claimed to be from Bathsheba. That when she came to visit Solomon, that was where she had her children with him and went back to Ethiopia with them. And if you read in Song of Solomon, he talks about her skin being black and beautiful. And so today, when you go to Israel, you'll see some very tall, black Ethiopian Jews. A matter of fact, in some of the hostages that were Jewish that got carried away on October 7th, there was at least one I saw that was black, maybe more. So, anywho,
the Ethiopians, King Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, he said at one time that the Ark of the Covenant was somewhere in Ethiopia. Did you ever hear that?
Oh yeah, I've heard all those things, yeah. Anyway, she is letting it be known here. This has happened, and it was sort of on the sly, and we don't approve of it, didn't approve of it. Now, if you're going to make a point on this, when we get to Deuteronomy 7, Moses is going to double down from the Lord on the intermarrying of other nations. And he seems to give a fairly extensive list on the nations living inside the border of Israel. And you can see there in Deuteronomy 7, verse 1, he says the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, but no Cushites. No Cushites. Cush, also Ethiopia. The land of Cush is Ethiopia. And there is none of that. So there was no speaking against that. And, it's interesting, too, that the Moabites and Amalekites will be added later, but they aren't on this list at this time. But he does say in verse 3 very clearly, nor shall you make marriages with them. So that did stand. And so she did have a point. Now, somebody, asked the questions about Zipporah. What happened to his first wife? Now, she clearly was from Midian. Now, it's possible she's an Ethiopian woman, because you say, well, they were living in Midian. He was a priest of Midian. It doesn't necessarily mean he was started from that region. Moses was down there, and he was an Egyptian Jew, and he was in Midian. So there, obviously, maybe Jethro was himself an Ethiopian, and his 7 daughters were all Ethiopians. It doesn't say that. It makes it really clear that they were Midianites. So when we look at, the little bits of Moses' first marriage with Zipporah, it seems like, she had the A-type personality, and we're going to learn it again tonight, that Moses was the meek one. Opposites attract. But the one scene we have is when she is going reluctantly to Egypt with Moses. He's 80. I don't know what that makes her, but she has the 2 sons, which I'm thinking were, adults, and she was probably, somewhere, maybe not 80, but maybe 60 or something. I don't know. But God was going to kill Moses, and then she had to quickly circumcise her 2 boys, because she put her foot down back in Midian and said, there is no way. I don't care what your God says. I don't care what he said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You are not going to, cut the foreskin on my 2 boys. Absolutely not. And she won the argument. And Moses almost died, and then she finally did at an adult age, which I'm sure they weren't too happy about. But it didn't tell us about that. But Moses came very close to dying, and Zipporah. But then it seems that she turned back at that point, because later Jethro brings her back. Now you got to remember, from them leaving Egypt, it's been 13 months. And before that, we could say maybe he was there a year during the plagues. Most people say about 9 months during the plagues. So in that time, she might have just said, I'm done with you. I'm going to go back to Midian and live. Or, I'm walking away from this marriage. Very possible. Or she died. Or she's still alive, but Moses taking a second wife, which is very possible in the culture of this day to have more than one wife. But it does, we don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but here's Moses in his 80s now, 81, 82, and he's human. We saw in the last chapter he was very human in his breakdown, and now he is human and wanting a companionship of a lady. Some commentators believe that she was taken from the mixed multitude. And that's part of the reason Miriam and Aaron are upset, is because her family was a part of the insurrection that happened in chapter 11 over not having meat and only eating manna. And so that was a part of it. So there's a lot of things that you can speculate into, but either way, they had a point. But let me tell you a couple of things here. Number one, there was no mention of forbidding to marry an Ethiopian or Cushite. But 2, in the prophetic scheme of things, Moses was done. He had no lineage. The tribe he would have been a part of was the Levitical tribe. But his sons were not of his brother Aaron. So basically, his family, even if he had kids with this Ethiopian woman or the kids he had with the Midianite wife, Zipporah, they had no part nor portion in Israel. They were done. There was no lineage for them in the nation of Israel. It ended with Moses. So in a real practical sense, from God's point of view, it didn't matter who he married. It didn't matter who his kids were, because they had no part nor portion in the future prophetic timeline of the nation of Israel. And so those are all the various possibilities. One more possibility I'll give you the commentators say, and that was they were talking about Zipporah, but they used the term Ethiopian to sort of speak as a derogatory term. Like saying, she is she's so far out, she might as well be an Ethiopian. She's not, but that's sort of a slur against her. I don't find that to be very... Well, in the New Testament, we know that nationality has no part nor portion. In Romans 10, verse 12, for there's no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon his name. Colossians 3:11, where there were neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. However, there is a sense on the spiritual level that you need to be on the same page. And so here it's saying believer and unbeliever, but I can tell you also I've seen mature believers marry non-mature believers, and it be almost equally as hard of a life. But you remember that passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 11 all through chapter 7, verse 1. Where he says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And Paul here is quoting the Old Testament, but he's pretty harsh. What fellowship does righteousness have to do with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Whoa, Satan. And what part then does a believer have with an unbeliever? And then he makes it clear, you're the temple of the living God, not the temple of an idol. And so I'll dwell with them and among them if they come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Then they will have that fellowship. Well, Numbers chapter 12, now verse 2. So they said, Miriam said, but we're learning about Aaron, right? Aaron is an amiable guy. He's not a guy with a deep character. He's not a guy with a deep conviction. Right? I mean, we saw that in Exodus. Moses is gone for a month, and they're like, hey, we want to go back to Egypt. And Aaron's like, I'll make the calf. Give me all your gold. I'll make the golden calf we can worship. It's like, thank you, brother. And where was Miriam during that? She was there. But Aaron was amiable. He seems to be easily persuaded or moved, which is not a very good thing, but that's nevertheless what he has. And again, Aaron's in that place by concession, not by God's will. Moses' stubbornness got Aaron where he was because he wanted to not be the head guy, even though he was the head guy. And so they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? ? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. When God observes his children questioning the authority and questioning that their authority should be at least equal or greater, because their contribution is not appreciated as much as the guy in charge, but without their contribution, this church would not have grown, or this ministry wouldn't have done it. And I've seen that with worship leaders where they're like, oh yeah, this church would not be anywhere without my piano playing or guitar playing or my voice or my skills, But nevertheless, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard to God when somebody does that. Oh, he hears it. It's annoying because remember, this is how it all started. We find out from Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 38, where Satan, Lucifer, the beautiful person, Ezekiel 38 goes into talking about how he was perfect in splendor and beauty. And he said, should I not be lifted up at least equal? I will be. And then God said, I'm going to cast you down to the earth. And you can read about that in Ezekiel 38. But in this case, God heard it because it was like, oh. Did God speak through Aaron? He sure did. Did God speak through Miriam? God graciously called her a prophetess. And she sang a beautiful song that was recorded, and the women followed her. She had a strong presence, and being Moses' older sister who saved his life, and older brother whom they had known from Egypt their whole lives, unlike Moses, there was a prestige there, but not the prestige they wanted. So Aaron was the high priest. Not enough. Miriam's a prophetess. Not enough. And many think that the real issue here is that they are not being recognized in the authority they should be, especially after Moses just got 70 leaders, and they weren't one of them. You see, I think they thought for sure they were going to be one of the top dogs. And they're excluded. As a matter of fact, in this new regime, you got Moses and the 70, and we're off to the side here. Aaron's doing his thing on the side, and it's a lot of work, and in the same time, they're not being elevated in the way they want to be elevated. I think James nails it. In James chapter 3, verse 13 to 18, he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by the good conduct of his works, and they're done in the what? Meekness of wisdom." Humility, it's the same word. The humbleness of wisdom. Verse 14, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts," boy, she did. He did, right? Her and Aaron, they sure did. "Do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly and sensual and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, then gentle." And here's the three most important words of this whole thing: willing to yield. God will put you in situations and see if you yield or not, just to test you so you can see your own heart. "Full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And so the Lord heard this, just like he heard Satan. In Ezekiel 28, 15 to 17, I'll just read a little bit there. It says, "You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. By abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence." It's an analogy here in Ezekiel of Tyre and Sidon as well. "But therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God. I destroyed you, O covering cherubim, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up. Your heart was lifted up with pride," literally, the NIV says, "because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground," or to the earth, the NIV says. "I laid you before kings that they may gaze," or sort of mock you, gaze at you and mock you. Satan, the beginning of the sin of the world that we know, started with this pride over who should be the guy who's the highest in authority, or at least I should be equal in authority, Isaiah 14 says. Solomon got it right in Proverbs 8:13. God speaking, "I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech." In Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall." The quickest route to destruction is by pride, for sure, for sure. Peter gives it right, the heart we should all have. In 1 Peter 5, looking at the second part of verse 5 and verse 6, "Yes, all of you, be submissive to one another. Be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." You saw that with Joseph, didn't we? How he humbled himself and became the best servant. Then he humbled himself and became the best prisoner. And he humbled himself under the mighty hand of God. Didn't get bitter in his heart towards God or his brothers. And God exalted him at the right time. Well, now in Numbers chapter 3. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. Now what's funny about this is, from what we understand, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So do you think he wrote this? Now we do know the very end of Joshua, or the very end of Deuteronomy, Moses' death is recorded. So we assume he didn't write that. But probably Joshua did. And it's possible Joshua wrote this too. But either way, if Moses wrote it, it didn't mean he wasn't humble. You know that? Because humility is really not about saying, oh, I'm so humble. No, it's humility is when you're rightly appraising yourself, right? So if Elon said, oh, I'm really not the richest man in the world, but you are. I mean, it doesn't sound like humility. It sounds like false humility, doesn't it? Or if LeBron James would say, I'm sort of good at basketball. I'm really not that great. Again, it wouldn't be humility. It'd be a false humility. I think Paul gets it perfect. In Romans 12, verse 3, he says, for I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dwelt to each one a measure of faith. Remember, Paul said in 1 Corinthians, says, I labor more than all, but not I, the grace of God. But he said certain things like that, it's my gospel, and I had to rebuke Peter, the guy who said his number one apostle, and I had to rebuke him. So again, humility, I like that. It's like, as you ought to think soberly, clearly, properly, and to realize it comes from the grace of God and by the gifts of God. Jesus said something similar about himself. As a matter of fact, the only description we have of Jesus, he gave himself. And in Matthew 11, verse 28, he said this about himself. Come to me, all you who labor and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am humble. Right here. I am gentle and lowly in heart. I am meek and humble. And you will find a rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So Moses truly was. At the moment these guys are accusing him of lording it over them, the moment they're accusing Moses of being arrogant, you see, it's not Miriam and Aaron that are in the wrong. We just think that you are creating a paradigm, Moses, where you put yourself above us. And it's because of the pride in your heart that you're doing that. And with this, the authority trip that you're on, you didn't even ask permission. You didn't even make a public display of it. You married this Ethiopian woman, and she's been your wife now for several months, and you've never brought it up at any of the board meetings. You never let it be known at any of the congregational times together. And a lot of people have no idea. But we know, because you're our brother. Of course, what's the Bible say? No prophet has honor in his own hometown among his own relatives, right? And so in their mind, they've seen Moses in his humanness. Of course, we saw it at the very beginning when God called Moses. He's like, nope, not going. Mm-mm. They knew how fleshly Moses could be, so to speak. But when God heard this, he knew the truth. God didn't look just on the outward man. God looked upon the heart. And on the entire face of the planet, Moses was the most meek, humble human being. And of course, Christ says that of himself, basically, when he was on the earth.
Well, in verse 4 and 5, so after the Lord heard this, suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting. So the three came out. We've all had, if you have siblings, you've all had that with your mom or your dad, you hear the tone outside, For me, it was, Brian, Steve, and Sandra, get it over here now in the backyard. And we knew, what are we doing? There's a big mess, and it's like, no, it was them, it wasn't me, or usually we broke something, We used to do crazy stuff, Hey, let's cut the hose up and make, So anyway, when all three of us got called together at the same time to get out here to the tabernacle, something's going on. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they went forward. So the pillar of the cloud's there, which they have not experienced. They've experienced it from afar. When Moses came to the tabernacle, the cloud came down. But now they're right there, and God said, step forward into the cloud, towards the form, the power, the presence of God. And then God speaks rather poetically. In verse 6 through 9, then he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak to him face to face. Literally in the Hebrew, it's mouth to mouth. Even plainly and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of God. Interesting, this word form is the same word in Exodus 20 when it says, thou shalt make no images of God, because that would be idolatry. It's the same word. He saw God in a form, in an image. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So the anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. So man, they're walking away going, whoa, we just got bawled out. Now, interesting, if you noted there, God says, my servant Moses, who is faithful in all my house. God calling Moses servant and God calling Moses faithful. We know about those two things, don't we? Those are the two highest compliments that God could give, because that is in essence the embodiment of Jesus himself. And interesting, when we study Hebrews, he says there's two guys with these two qualifications of servant and faithful, and there's never been two guys like it. Moses and Jesus. Look in Hebrews 3, verse 1 through 5 there. Therefore, holy brethren, partake of the heavenly calling. Consider the apostle and the high priest of your confession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. Quoting right here out of chapter 12. For this one has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as what? A servant, for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterwards. Wow. You got the law from Moses, and Moses, this type of Christ, he was in so many ways a type of the nature of Jesus so perfectly. The humblest man on earth, as Jesus later would be. He was this servant. His humility caused him to be the servant of all men. Because of humility, he just plugged away, being faithful. Jesus said in Mark 9:35, He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. And later in Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. With humility to live as a servant of God and God for his house and for his kingdom. Moses lived in that way his entire time serving the Lord. And of course, this mind of Christ should be in all of us. Philippians 2, right? Verse 5 through 8. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a, what? A servant, a bondservant, coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. And so Moses was an amazing person, and these guys had so little respect for God raising Moses up, and God speaking to Moses, and Moses' face shining, and Moses being perfect in God's eyes as a humble servant, doing all in his house that he's asked him to do. And they had something in their minds that they thought they could stand in the place to rebuke Moses as their equal or even their lesser. And God said, here, I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of what Moses gets all the time. Step forward. And I'm sure they couldn't handle it because their hearts weren't right with God. And when God left, they were like, whew. But what happens in verse 10? When the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned around towards Miriam, and there she was, a leper. So earlier in the last verse, suddenly God shouted, Miriam, Moses, Aaron, get out here. Get over the tabernacle. Suddenly God appeared. Suddenly God called them to come near. And then suddenly, after God departed, Aaron looks at Miriam like, whoa, you want to do a little after discussion with just our discussion with God? And when he noticed, oh my goodness, she's a leper. She has leprosy, which is a death sentence, which means not only will she not be near, she won't be anywhere near anybody. And interesting, she's willing to mock that Ethiopian woman, that mixed multitude group maybe, who's on the outskirts. It doesn't have one of the legs of the east, west, north, or south. There's sort of a straggler at the end of the tail of this great group of people. And guess where she's going to be now? Whoa. Pride does come before destruction. Or what is it? Pride before the fall, and haughtiness before destruction. Yeah. It's funny, Calvin got a lot of those scriptures wrong, and then it kept getting documented more wrong from Calvin's quote, and so we all have, got it wrong as well. But this is a serious thing. And in verse 11 and 12, so Aaron said to Moses, oh, my Lord, please do not lay this sin on us in which we have done foolishly, in which we have sinned. Please do not let her be as one dead, whose flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb. I don't know what he's thinking of there. But he's just saying, my older sister, Miriam, this one who saved you as a baby, we can't, please, immediately you see Aaron repenting. That's a good thing, isn't it? He just says, we act foolishly, she was talking to me and I was talking to her and we let our complaints, so let's go tell Moses, we figured out. And God immediately steps in. Interesting. So many of the times in the Bible, when God's man is being attacked, that God's person doesn't have to defend themselves. I remember Chuck Smith talking about how they had written a piece in Times Magazine about the Jesus movement, about their church, and about Chuck, and said some very, very bad things. And basically making it sound like heresy, and Chuck was a cult leader, and Chuck, somebody showed it to him, and Chuck read that, and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna get, he wrote this old letter out to send to them to threaten them to, make retractions on this. And God just put his heavy hand on Chuck and said, Chuck, I've done this thing. All these thousands of people coming to Christ and you being out there baptizing all 1,000 people, you keep your mouth shut and I will defend you. You start speaking, you're going to defend yourself. But if you shut up and be quiet, I'll defend you. The next month, the front page of the Time magazine was Chuck with a big smile baptizing these hippies, talking about how it's the greatest revival that had happened. And so again here, you can go back, you look at Daniel and how God stood for Daniel. Or Joseph, again, we talked about him a minute ago. And of course, that was the heart of Jesus on the cross, was it not? He didn't have to defend himself. And so Aaron repents, he cries out and says, please don't let this happen. And Moses cried out to the Lord saying, please heal her, God, I pray. So Moses he's such a humble man. He has no pride in his heart. He has no antagonism. He's like, well, that's what God wants to do to Miriam. That's what God can do. It's, she made her bed, she can lie in it because she did act like she was equal in power to me. And that was no place she should have ever trotted, No, Moses didn't do that. It reminds me of the passage where Paul spoke. And I wonder again if he's thinking of these passages when he wrote some of these letters. In Galatians 6 and verse 1 through 5, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. There's no sin that's not common to all men, right? Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Don't you think Paul was thinking about Numbers 12 when he wrote Galatians 5 there? Because that verse 3 doesn't really fit, unless he's referring to the story. But let each one examine himself, he says in verse 4, of his own work. Then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. So like Paul in Romans 12, just appraise yourself correctly. For each one shall bear his own load. But that's not where it ends. Verse 7 and 8, skip on down to Galatians 6, verse 7 and 8. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Do you notice there how he turns that? And he gives the two aspects of the nature of God. God was angry. Why were you not afraid to speak against the authority that I put in place? He leaves. Turns, there's Miriam with leprosy. And he cries out, not this, Lord. And then notice what the Lord said to Moses, verse 14 to 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, would she not be ashamed 7 days? She would become unclean, according to the Levitical law, right? For 7 days. Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days. Let her go hang out with the mixed multitude and the other lepers or people with spots on them. They're wondering if they're going to become a leper or something like that. Kick her out there. Let her walk humbly for 7 days. And the people did not journey till Miriam was brought in again. So she didn't have to travel along with the mixed multitude or the others who were in that camp. But afterwards, the people moved from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran, which we know from chapter 10 that had happened. So this is another story that happened somewhere in there. before chapter 10. Again, this story. I think of Jesus again on the cross. It says in Isaiah 53 that he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. How did he do it? He humbled himself to the point of death. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before his shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. You know, we often don't think about that. We hear the 7 sayings of Christ, but he was on the cross for 6 hours, wasn't it? So that's like sort of little tiny sentences, you know. Into your hands I put my spirit. That's not a very long sentence. It's just these little tiny bits he gets out. But mostly he was just there looking like a criminal. Everybody thinking he's one of the 3 criminals, spitting on him, ripping his beard out, throwing stuff at him. You healed others, heal yourself. If you're so righteous and you're so holy, and just take yourself off the cross right now and show us that you shouldn't be judged. But he did not curse back. He did not rival back. But because 2 Peter 3 says, because he shut his mouth, therefore all the sheep who had been going astray have now come back to the master. Because of that. Micah 6:4, hundreds of years later, God now talking about these times, looking back at the old photo album. Oh, yeah, here's where they were in Paran, you know. And what does God say about them now, hundreds of years later? Micah 6:4, he says, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam, like the 3 amigos. It wasn't and Moses and his siblings. It made him sound like they were all 3, these great leaders and gifts to the people equally. So it is an interesting thing to look at the mind of God in this. And then again, we look at this and start to think about it, meditate on it, and ask ourselves the question, once again, is this chapter 12 a picture of Christ to us? Moses had a Gentile bride. Wasn't well known, but he had her. And they didn't like the fact that he had a Gentile bride. Christ has a Gentile bride. And Jews today aren't too happy about Christ's Gentile bride. They're jealous of his Gentile bride. Jesus' brothers stood against him. In John 6 or 7, remember they tried to get him to go down to the festival openly, knowing that they were waiting to kill Jesus. They did not like it. They did not believe in him. Moses' siblings did not, in the same way, really respect Moses. Jesus was the humblest man on earth, and Moses of his time was the humblest man on earth. Moses interceded for them, and of course, Jesus intercedes for us, doesn't he? I think there is a prophetic picture in this rather bizarre story, helping us to see Christ and his nature.